She gave him everything, 10 years of her life, every dollar she ever saved, her father's house, her whole heart, and in return, he handed her 2 cardboard boxes and locked the door behind her. What he did not know, what he could not have known, was that the woman he just threw away like an old habit was about to become the reason his entire world came crashing down around him. And the man who would make that happen was already sitting quietly across the street, watching, waiting for a moment he had been preparing for since long before Ryan Whitmore ever learned her name. Her name was Grace Delaney, though very soon she would go back to using her father's name instead of the one she had married into. On the outside, this looked like an ordinary Tuesday morning in a quiet suburb just outside Columbus, Ohio. Moving trucks lined the curb. Neighbors watered their lawns and pretended not to stare. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked at nothing in particular. But nothing about that morning was ordinary at all, because in less than 24 hours, everything anyone believed they understood about Grace, about her husband, and about the house she was being forced to leave behind, was about to be turned completely upside down. Grace sat in the front seat of a rented moving truck with 2 boxes resting in her lap, the only 2 boxes she had been allowed to take. Through the windshield, she watched her husband of 10 years, Ryan Whitmore, lift another woman into his arms and carry her across the threshold of the house that had belonged to Grace's father. She built his empire with her bare hands. He repaid her with a moving truck and a locked door. He had no idea whose daughter he had just thrown out into the street, and he had even less idea of who was already keeping track of every single thing he did. For a few seconds, Grace didn't move at all. She didn't cry. She didn't honk the horn or roll down the window to scream the way anyone watching might have expected her to. She simply sat there, perfectly still, as the front door closed behind them, the same door her father used to walk through every evening after work, with grease still under his fingernails and a tired smile on his face. And then, just like that, the porch light clicked off, and the whole street seemed to fall quiet, as if it, too, understood that something had just ended, and something else had already begun. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. What Ryan did not see, because he never once bothered to look, was the black car parked 2 houses down, engine running quietly, that had been sitting there off and on for nearly 3 weeks. Inside it sat a man named Daniel Kang, dressed plainly, no driver, no bodyguards in sight, watching that house the way a person watches something they have waited an entire lifetime to see again. Grace had never met him. She had never even heard his name, but somehow he already knew hers. And more than that, he knew exactly which name was actually printed on the deed to that house, a name that had nothing at all to do with Ryan Whitmore. Why would a man like that, a man whose name alone could move markets in 3 different countries, spend 3 weeks parked outside a modest house in Ohio, watching a woman he had never spoken to? Why did he wait until the exact morning she lost everything to finally step out of that car? And why, out of everyone Ryan Whitmore had wronged, cheated, or quietly stepped over on his way to the top, was Grace the one person whose fall someone had been watching for years, almost as if they had known it was coming long before Grace herself did? To understand how a stranger like Daniel Kang ended up outside that house on the very day Grace lost everything, you have to go back more than 20 years to a version of her father that Grace herself barely knew existed. Because Frank Delaney was not simply the quiet mechanic who raised his daughter alone after her mother passed away. Frank Delaney was a man who once saved a life on the other side of the world, in circumstances he never once spoke of, not to his neighbors, not to his closest friends, and not even to the daughter he loved more than his own life. So here is where this story really begins. Not with the divorce papers Ryan had drawn up in secret over the course of several months. Not with Chloe, the woman he chose to replace 10 years of loyalty with. This story begins with a promise made decades earlier, in a place none of them had ever set foot in, between two men whose paths were never supposed to cross again. And by the time this story ends, you will understand exactly why Ryan Whitmore's biggest mistake was never simply leaving his wife. His biggest mistake was believing he already knew everything there was to know about the quiet woman he left behind. To understand how Grace Delaney ended up sitting in that moving truck with only 2 boxes to her name, you have to go back 11 years, to a small diner on the edge of Columbus where she worked double shifts just to help pay her way through community college. She was 23 then, tired most days, but never once bitter about it. She believed, the way a lot of people her age still believed back then, that hard work eventually paid off, that if you gave enough of yourself to something, it would eventually give something back. It was there, refilling coffee at table 6, that she first met a broke, ambitious young man named Ryan Whitmore, who talked more about the future he wanted than the life he actually had. Ryan was charming in the way certain men are charming when they have nothing yet but are absolutely convinced they will have everything someday. He had a business degree he could barely afford, and a plan he repeated so often it started to sound like a prayer. Grace found that kind of hunger attractive. She had grown up watching her father, Frank Delaney, work with his hands every single day and never once complain, so ambition, to her, looked like virtue. She did not yet understand that there is a version of ambition that eventually needs someone to blame for everything it never got to be, and a version of shame that hides itself as drive. They married 2 years later in a small ceremony behind her father's house, the same house Frank had bought with cash nobody ever asked him about, the same house Grace had grown up in. Frank walked her down a makeshift aisle made of folding chairs and paper lanterns, and though he smiled the entire time, Grace noticed something in his eyes that day she never fully understood until years later. It was not sadness exactly. It was something closer to worry, the kind of worry a man carries when he knows a storm is somewhere out on the horizon, even if nobody else can see the clouds yet. He never explained it. He simply hugged his daughter a little longer than usual and told her to always trust her own judgment, no matter what anyone else told her to believe. For the first several years, Grace worked 2 jobs while Ryan built his business from almost nothing, a small logistics company that started in a garage and slowly grew into something people in the industry began to notice. She handled the books they could not afford to pay someone else to handle. She answered client emails after midnight. She learned to stretch a grocery budget so thin it could feed 2 people on $20 a week when the company needed every spare dollar reinvested. Ryan used to tell people, back then, that Grace was the reason any of it was possible, that he would have quit a dozen times over if she had not been standing behind him refusing to let him give up. But success has a strange way of rewriting memory. As the company grew, so did the version of the story Ryan told about himself. Slowly, the struggling years became a chapter he preferred not to revisit out loud, especially not in rooms filled with new investors and polished executives who assumed a man like him had always belonged exactly where he now stood. Grace noticed the shift before she could name it. He introduced her differently at company dinners. He stopped mentioning the diner, the double shifts, the years she spent making $10 stretch further than it should have been able to. It was never one moment. It was 100 small ones, each easy enough to excuse on its own. Frank Delaney passed away quietly in his sleep, 3 years before the events of this story, leaving Grace the modest house she grew up in, and very little else that anyone could see. At the funeral, an older man Grace did not recognize approached her briefly, offered his condolences in careful, accented English, and left without giving his name. She assumed he was an old co-worker of her father's, someone from one of the overseas construction jobs Frank occasionally mentioned but never elaborated on. She thought nothing more of it. She had no way of knowing that the man standing quietly at the edge of that funeral would, years later, be the very reason her entire life changed. Before he left that day, Frank had given Grace one final gift, a small jade pendant she had never seen before, wrapped in a handkerchief and placed in her hands only days before he died. He told her to keep it somewhere safe and never sell it, no matter how difficult things might become. When she asked him where it came from, he only said that it belonged to a promise made a long time ago, one he intended to keep until the day he no longer could. Grace placed it carefully in a drawer and largely forgot about it, the way people often do with the strange, quiet things their parents leave behind, never once suspecting that a piece of jewelry could hold the weight of an entire debt. By the time Ryan's company secured a partnership with a mysterious group of overseas investors, nobody in his office could quite explain, Grace had already stopped asking questions about his late nights, his sudden trips, the new associate named Chloe Sinclair who seemed to appear in every important meeting. She told herself it was simply the cost of building something big, the same story she had told herself for a decade. She did not yet know that somewhere in that new partnership sat the very man who once stood quietly at her father's funeral, and that he had been watching her, patiently, from a distance, waiting for the moment Ryan Whitmore would finally show everyone exactly who he really was. The morning Ryan finally said the words out loud, he did not raise his voice, and he did not look Grace in the eye either. He simply set a folder of papers on the kitchen table, the same table where she had once balanced his company's books at midnight, and told her the marriage was over. He said it the way a man announces a decision that has already been made somewhere else, in some other room, long before this conversation ever began. Grace did not scream. She did not throw anything. She asked only one question, quietly, and it was not about the marriage at all. She asked him whose name he thought was actually on the deed to the house they were standing in. Ryan barely looked up from his phone when he answered her. He told her the house had already been handled, that his legal team had taken care of everything weeks earlier, and that she had 48 hours to collect whatever she needed and leave. He did not explain how a house Grace's father had paid for in full, years before she ever met Ryan, had somehow ended up folded into a divorce settlement favoring him. He did not need to explain it. He had already decided the conversation was finished, the same way he had already decided, months earlier, that Chloe Sinclair belonged in the life he was building next, and that Grace simply did not. What Ryan did not know, standing in that kitchen with his phone in his hand, was that his business partner, Marcus Bell, had spent the entire previous week trying to warn him about something far more dangerous than a difficult divorce. The overseas investment group backing their newest expansion, the one that had quietly funded almost every major deal the company closed that year, had grown strangely quiet in the days leading up to this conversation. Marcus had tried twice to schedule a call with their primary contact and been redirected both times without explanation. He mentioned it to Ryan in passing, almost as an afterthought, and Ryan waved it off the way he waved off most things that were not directly in front of him. As Grace packed the last of her father's belongings into a single cardboard box that afternoon, her hands moving mechanically through drawers she had not opened in years, something small and wrapped in cloth slipped loose and fell to the floor. It was the jade pendant her father had given her before he died, the one she had almost forgotten existed. She knelt down slowly to pick it up, turning it over once in her palm, and for reasons she could not explain, she felt an unfamiliar chill pass through the room, as though the object itself understood something she did not yet. She had no way of knowing that, at that exact moment, a man parked 2 houses down the street had gone completely still, watching a shape in the window he recognized instantly. Daniel Kang had seen that pendant only once before in his life, more than 2 decades earlier, half a world away, on a night he had spent years trying not to think about. Seeing it again now in the hands of a woman being forced out of her own father's house was not a coincidence to him at all. It was, in his mind, something closer to a debt finally coming due. He did not approach the house that day. He simply watched Grace carry her boxes to the truck, watched the porch light click off behind her, and understood, with a certainty he had carried quietly for 20 years, that the time had finally come to do what he had promised himself he would do the moment this day arrived. Grace spent her first 2 nights after the divorce in a small roadside motel just outside the city, the kind of place with a flickering sign and thin walls, telling herself it was only temporary while she figured out her next move. She had almost no savings of her own, since most of what she earned over the years had gone directly back into Ryan's company, an investment she now understood would never be returned to her in any form. On the second evening, as she sat on the edge of the bed staring at nothing in particular, there was a knock at her door. Standing outside was a man in a plain dark suit, polite but unfamiliar, who introduced himself only as someone working on behalf of a man named Daniel Kang. Grace's first instinct was suspicion. She had read enough stories, seen enough warnings online, to assume this was some kind of scam targeting women in exactly her situation. Vulnerable, recently divorced, with nowhere else to turn. She refused the man's offer politely and closed the door, but the driver did not leave. He simply said one sentence through the door before stepping back to his car, a sentence that stopped Grace completely still. He told her that Mr. Kang wanted her to know her father's name was not forgotten, and that whenever she was ready to hear the rest of it, someone would be waiting. Then he left a plain card on the ground and walked away without another word. It took Grace 3 more days to work up the nerve to call the number on that card, and even then, she expected very little to come of it. What she did not expect was to be picked up not by a stranger with vague promises, but by Daniel Kang himself, sitting quietly in the back of a car that looked far more expensive than anything she had ever ridden in. He did not rush the conversation. He did not ask her for anything. He simply asked if she remembered a small wooden toolbox her father used to keep in the garage, one with a dented lid and a faded sticker on the side, and when Grace said yes, something in Kang's expression shifted, as though a very old weight had finally begun to lift. To understand what Daniel Kang was carrying that day, you have to go back more than 20 years, to a cold night outside Busan, South Korea, where a 19-year-old named Min Jun Kang, the son of a man who had made powerful enemies, was walking home when three men stepped out of the shadows with clear intentions. He had no bodyguards that night, no warning, nothing standing between him and whatever was about to happen. The only other person on that street was an American mechanic working construction overseas, a quiet, unremarkable man named Frank Delaney, who did not know the boy, did not know his family, and had absolutely no reason to intervene. He intervened anyway, and he was shot doing it. Frank survived that night, though only barely, and he never once mentioned it to anyone back home, not even to the daughter he would raise alone in the years that followed. Min Jun Kang, terrified and grateful in equal measure, tried repeatedly afterward to repay him, to offer him money, protection, anything at all. Frank refused every single time. He told the young man only that he did not save his life to be owed something for it, and that if he truly wanted to repay the debt, he should simply become the kind of man worth having been saved. Min Jun Kang never forgot those words, and over the following 20 years, as he quietly built one of the most powerful and feared organizations in the region, he never stopped watching, from a careful distance, over the family of the man who had once bled on his behalf. Sitting across from Grace in that car, Daniel Kang finally said her father's name out loud, something he had not done in years, and told her everything, plainly and without embellishment. He told her about the toolbox, about the bullet Frank never spoke of, about the promise made on a quiet street that neither of them ever expected the other to remember. He told her that the investment group funding Ryan's company had been his the entire time, a coincidence he only discovered once Ryan's name crossed his desk during a routine review, and that the moment he realized who Ryan had chosen to discard, he understood exactly what needed to happen next. He was not offering Grace charity. He was finally settling a debt 2 decades in the making. Within days, the mysterious overseas investment group, backing Ryan's company, withdrew every dollar of committed funding without warning, citing nothing more than a shift in strategic priorities. Contracts that had taken years to secure collapsed within a single week. Marcus Bell, sensing the direction things were heading long before Ryan admitted it to himself, quietly resigned and took 2 of the company's largest remaining clients with him. Chloe Sinclair, whose interest in Ryan had always tracked closely alongside his financial trajectory, stopped returning his calls entirely once the offices began emptying out. Ryan, for the first time in nearly a decade, found himself standing in a building he could no longer afford to keep the lights on in, with absolutely no one left standing beside him. It took less than a month for Ryan Whitmore to lose almost everything he had spent 10 years building, and it took him even less time than that to figure out exactly where Grace had gone. He arrived at the gated entrance of Daniel Kang's private estate on a gray afternoon, disheveled in a way none of his former colleagues would have recognized, and asked to see his ex-wife, not Kang, believing somehow that Grace still owed him something, some explanation, some form of help. Grace walked out to meet him alone, calmly, without anger in her voice, and told him only that she hoped he eventually found whatever it was he had been chasing all those years, because it clearly was never her. Then she turned, walked back through the gate, and closed it herself. The story of Grace Delaney does not end with revenge, and it was never really about punishing Ryan Whitmore in the first place. It ends with a woman standing once again at the threshold of a home, only this time, she is the one deciding who is allowed to walk through the door. Somewhere along the way, Ryan mistook her patience for weakness, her silence for something small, never once stopping to ask what kind of woman could survive 10 years of being quietly erased and still choose grace instead of bitterness when everything finally came back around. Perhaps the real question this story leaves behind is not whether Ryan got what he deserved, but whether any of us truly know the weight carried by the people we decide are the easiest to walk away from. Before you go, we would love to know what you think. Would you have recognized the warning signs sooner than Grace did, or would her father's silence have fooled you too? Let us know in the comments where you are watching from today. And first in warning signs, if this story got to you, subscribe, because there are more of them. Thank you for staying with me. Take care of each other,